In 1988, three of the world's leading laboratories dropped a bombshell. The Shroud of Turin, the cloth millions believe once wrapped the body of Jesus, was dated to the Middle Ages. Was this the final nail in the coffin of a 2,000-year-old mystery, or a scientific mistake that only deepened the enigma? For centuries, the shroud has been more than fabric. It's been a sacred icon, a lightning rod for debate, and a battleground where science and faith collide. And tonight, we go straight into the heart of the controversy. Did carbon-14 testing truly solve the mystery, or did it open the door to even bigger questions? Let's begin with the test that changed everything back in 1988. In 1988, the Shroud of Turin faced one of the most decisive scientific tests in its history. For centuries, believers had claimed it was the burial cloth of Jesus himself, while skeptics suspected a clever medieval forgery. To settle the debate, the Catholic Church allowed scientists to perform radiocarbon dating on the fabric. A small strip of linen, about 7 by 1 centimeters, was carefully cut from one corner of the shroud. That single piece was then divided into smaller samples and distributed to 3 leading laboratories: Oxford in England, Zurich in Switzerland, and the University of Arizona in the United States. Each lab worked independently, using the most advanced technology available at the time, accelerator mass spectrometry, or AMS. This technique measures the ratio of carbon isotopes with extreme sensitivity, offering far more precision than older dating methods. After months of analysis, the results were combined and published in Nature in 1989. The conclusion was dramatic. With 95% confidence, the cloth dated between 1260 and 1390 AD. In other words, the shroud wasn't from the 1st century, it came from the Middle Ages. And that date matched, almost too perfectly, with the first recorded appearance of the shroud in Europe during the 14th century. The press went wild. Headlines declared the case closed, calling the study the final nail in the coffin of the shroud. For many, the mystery was over. But was it really? A closer look reveals important limits to what the test could prove. Radiocarbon dating can tell us the age of the fibers in that small corner, but not the entire cloth, and certainly not the origin of the image imprinted on it. And here lies the problem. The sample came from a single spot, a corner that may have been patched or contaminated after fires, repairs, and centuries of handling. Even the best AMS technology depends heavily on how well the sample is cleaned and whether contaminants, smoke, bacteria, or even newer threads remain in the fibers. From a theological perspective, this raises a deeper reflection. Science has every right to measure, to test, to question. But faith reminds us that data can only answer the narrow question asked. In this case, the question was, how old are the fibers from this one corner? It did not and could not explain why the image on the shroud has 3-dimensional qualities, or why traces of pollen and blood seem to connect it to the Middle East. So, rather than closing the case, the 1988 test may have opened another chapter. Was it proof of a medieval forgery, or just a snapshot of one part of a much larger story? And perhaps the real lesson here is this: science is powerful, but it's not always the final word. Sometimes it only shows us one layer of a mystery that runs far deeper. After the dramatic announcement in 1988, the debate didn't end, it only deepened. Scholars and scientists began raising serious objections about the way the carbon dating was carried out and about what the results could really prove. 4 main criticisms stand out. First, the question of a patched sample. The corner chosen for testing came from a section badly damaged in the fire of 1532. Many experts believe that area had been reinforced with newer cotton threads woven into the original linen. In 2005, chemist Raymond Rogers from Los Alamos reported that fibers from that region showed traces of cotton, dye, and even chemical coatings. His conclusion? The coroner tested in 1988 may not have been part of the original cloth at all. If that's true, then the radiocarbon date reflects the repair, not the shroud itself. It's like cutting a patch from an old jacket, testing it, and then declaring the whole jacket is brand new. Second, environmental contamination. For centuries, the shroud has been exposed to candles, incense, smoke, water, and even bacteria. All of these can introduce carbon from outside sources. Radiocarbon dating is extremely sensitive, and if cleaning isn't done thoroughly, the fibers can look younger than they really are. Later reviews of the raw data showed inconsistencies between subsamples, another clue that contamination might not have been fully removed. Third, inconsistency across laboratories. The three labs, Oxford, Zurich, and Arizona, did not get identical results. In fact, statistical reanalysis shows a pattern. The dates varied depending on where in the corner the sample came from. That's a red flag. In good science, different labs should converge on the same answer. When they don't, it usually means the sample itself is heterogeneous, or the pre-treatment wasn't uniform. Either way, it weakens the idea that one precise date can settle the question once and for all. Fourth, conflict with other lines of evidence. The carbon-14 date points to the Middle Ages, but other studies suggest something different. In 1978, the CEORP team reported no trace of paint or pigments on the cloth, and the image itself contained three-dimensional information when analyzed with NASA's VP8 image processor. That is very hard to explain as a medieval painting. Other researchers have argued that pollen on the cloth came from plants native to the Middle East. The reliability of that pollen evidence is debated, but it shows how messy the bigger picture really is. And then there are the blood stains, matching remarkably well with the wounds described in the New Testament. Taken together, these criticisms don't automatically prove the shroud is ancient, but they do show that the 1988 test is far from the last word. From a theological perspective, it's a reminder that science is valuable, but it's never absolute. Carbon dating can tell us the age of one small corner of fabric. It cannot explain how the image was formed, or why so many details on the cloth align with biblical accounts. So here's the open question for us today. If another round of testing were allowed, what should be the top priority? Multiple samples from across the cloth, stricter cleaning protocols, or a broader investigation that looks not just at carbon dating, but at the image, the blood, the pollen, and the weave itself. Just like in a forensic case, when evidence doesn't all line up. The wise investigator doesn't close the file. The carbon-14 test sparked controversy, but the criticisms that followed may have made the shroud even more mysterious than before. And that leads us naturally to the next step. What lessons can we learn about science, about faith, and about the way we search for truth when the evidence refuses to give us easy answers? When the carbon-14 results were released in 1988, the scientific world largely treated them as decisive. To most researchers, the Shroud of Turin was a medieval creation dated between 1260 and 1390, and that seemed to close the case. From this perspective, the shroud was no longer an artifact from the time of Jesus, but a religious object from the Middle Ages, perhaps crafted for devotion or display. Funding and research energy shifted in that direction, with many studies focusing on how such an image could have been produced in medieval Europe. But not everyone agreed. Within the faith community, and among some independent scholars, the 1988 test was seen not as a final verdict, but as a flawed experiment. They argued the sample was too limited, just one corner of the cloth, and possibly even repaired centuries after the fire of 1532. They pointed to conflicting evidence, chemical analysis suggesting patches, traces of blood, pollen consistent with the Middle East, and a mysterious three-dimensional quality in the image that no known medieval technique can fully explain. For them, the carbon-14 test didn't close the case, it simply raised more questions. And that tension has made the Shroud one of the most hotly debated artifacts in history, standing at the crossroads of science and faith. One side insists the data is clear, it's medieval. The other insists the method was flawed, the science itself fell short. The result? The Shroud is no longer just a piece of cloth. It has become a mirror reflecting how differently we humans approach truth, whether through data, through tradition, or through faith. From a theological perspective, this debate is not a threat, but an invitation. Science can measure and test, but it always answers a narrow question. Faith can inspire and give meaning, but it must remain honest about the evidence. The Shroud reminds us that the pursuit of truth is not about picking sides, but about letting different forms of evidence speak to one another. So here's the bigger question. If we were given another chance to test the Shroud, where should we begin? With multiple samples taken from across the cloth, with stricter cleaning protocols to remove contamination, or with a broader investigation that doesn't stop at carbon dating, but also examines the image, the blood, the pollen, and the weave itself. Like in a forensic case, when the evidence doesn't all agree. The wise investigator doesn't slam the file shut. The 1988 test shook the world, but the criticisms that followed may have made the Shroud even more mysterious than before. And that naturally leads us to the next step, the lessons, both scientific and spiritual, that we can draw from this unfinished story. The Shroud of Turin debate isn't just about history or theology. It leaves us with practical lessons we can carry into science, faith, and daily life. First, science. Even the most sophisticated experiment can go wrong if the sampling process isn't solid. The 1988 carbon test reminds us that scientific authority depends not only on technology, but on how carefully the evidence is chosen. The bigger lesson is transparency. When all the raw data is published, both the clean results and the messy ones, other scientists can check, challenge, and refine the conclusions. That's how science moves forward, not by pretending to be perfect, but by being open to correction. Think of it like measuring the ocean's temperature with a single thermometer dropped into one harbor. You might get an exact reading, but it won't tell you the whole story. Second, faith. Science can explain a lot, down to the age of fibers and the chemistry of stains, but it cannot measure the spiritual weight of a symbol. Faith is not built only on perfect evidence. It is also shaped by inner transformation and lived experience. In the Bible, a sign always points beyond itself. Whether the Shroud is 1st century or medieval, the real question is how it calls people to reflect, to change, to live differently. A map is not the territory. The Shroud, whatever its age, points beyond the cloth to something greater. Third, everyday life. When faced with shocking results, the instinct is to swing to extremes, either deny them outright or treat them as unshakable truth. The wiser path is critical thinking without panic. Don't rush to crown one study or one hypothesis as the final truth. Science, like faith, works best when it leaves room for questions. Living with uncertainty can be uncomfortable, but it also keeps us humble and open. It's like getting unexpected medical test results. Do you accept them blindly, or do you seek a second opinion, compare notes, and make a thoughtful decision? The same patience applies here. Questions for you. If you sat on a new scientific panel to test the Shroud, What would your 3 non-negotiable rules be? Would you insist on multiple samples, full release of raw data, or a broader study of the image and biological traces? And more personally, if the results once again pointed to the Middle Ages, what part of your faith would shift and what part would remain unshaken? The ultimate lesson may be this: truth does not fear questions. Only blind certainty does. The Shroud continues to spark controversy, but it also invites us to approach both science and faith with humility, ready to learn, ready to be challenged, and ready to keep searching. The carbon-14 test of 1988 was a turning point. For science, it looked like a definitive answer. For people of faith, it was just a flawed experiment. And decades later, the debate still refuses to die. So what do we make of it? Is the Shroud of Turin a genuine relic of the resurrection, or the masterwork of a medieval artist? And more importantly, will science ever deliver an answer that ends the controversy once and for all? That's history. But what about you? What do you think? Share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear your perspective. And if you want to keep exploring mysteries like this one, don't forget to subscribe. We've got more investigations coming, and you won't want to miss them.